Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Global Spaceport Alliance Webinar Series. I'm really glad you could join us today, and I certainly hope for those in the United States that you had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. We have a pretty exciting schedule for you today, but before I get started, I just want to take a moment to go over a few things. First, I want to thank our sponsors, RS&H as our title sponsor, and BRPH and American Company as our co-sponsors. I also want to remind you all about Commercial Space Week that begins on January 29 next year. And it's made up, as I'm sure you're aware, of the Global Spaceport Summit, space mobility with the U.S. Space Force, which is now going up to 2 days instead of just one, and SpaceCom. Now, as you look at your calendars, the Global Spaceport Summit on the 29th of January is this year going to be sponsored again by RS&H, American Company, and BRPH. It's on January 29th in Orlando. If any of you have any suggestions with regard to the content of the summit, next slide, Jackson, please. I would welcome you to send me an email regarding your suggestions. Now, since our last webinar, I'm delighted to say we have a number of new members. Lindy Paso-Robles from California, Mead & Hunt, Scientific Lightning Solutions, the International Space University, and KBR. And actually, even since this slide was put up, we've just picked up another member, Highland and Islands Enterprise. So the membership in GSA is growing and is very, very exciting. Now, for those of you who are members and have not yet renewed your membership, please try to do so by the end of September, because as of October 1st, rates are going to go up. So please, I encourage you to get your dues paid as quickly as you can. Now what I'd like to do is turn things over to George Neild, our chairman, and he will say a few words and then introduce our speaker today. George, over to you.
Thank you, James. We are very pleased to have as our speaker today, Colonel Shannon DaSilva, who is the Deputy Director of Operations, Space Systems Command, which focuses on the assured access to space mission at Patrick Space Force Base, Florida. She leads the team responsible to the Field Command Commander for enterprise integration, space access, and future operations. Prior to her current job, Colonel DaSilva worked on the Headquarters Space Force staff as the Director for Joint Matters, and for the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy as the Deputy Director of Space Strategy and Plans. In both staff roles, she advised the nation's most senior civilian and military space leaders during the stand-up of the nation's newest armed service focused on the space domain. She holds a bachelor's degree in aviation from Purdue and a master's degree in aviation from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. She's also a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Air Command and Staff College and the National War College. Again, we're very excited to have Colonel DaSilva speak to us today on the topic of the spaceport of the future. Colonel DaSilva, over to you.
Wow, thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. Hopefully you can still hear me and my microphone issues have resolved. I apologize that I don't have a video option on my government computer, but it's definitely an honor to speak with you today, and I appreciate this opportunity to participate in the Global Spaceport Alliance and further partnerships for the assured access to space mission. As you heard from my bio, I'm Colonel Shannon DaSilva. I've spent over 20 years in the U.S. Armed Forces, 18 in the Air Force, and a very exciting last 3 years in the Space Force. For those who knew Colonel Jim Horn, I replaced him in July. Incredibly big shoes to fill, and I'm a big Jim Horn fan, so a lot of this that I'm briefing today is his work, and I just get to share it with you. I'm really personally excited to be back on the Space Coast. It's been over 12 years since I had the opportunity to be part of a launch mission, and looking forward to sharing some of the big changes that are coming in the near future. I'm planning to give you an update on 3 topics today, and I'd love to take questions throughout or afterward. I'm going to first talk about an update on the National Spaceport Interagency Working Group, and just some progress that's being made on that, and then give an update. We were recently fortunate to get a pretty nice pass back from the Office of Management and Budget at the White House of $1.3 billion for spaceport infrastructure funding between Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg. So I'll talk a little bit about that and how we hope to use that, and then give an update on our legislative proposal to Congress, 409, which allows us to do indirect charging for commercial providers to help facilitate the capacity that we see coming to the federal spaceports in the next few years. You want to go to the next slide, please? So for those who don't know, the Chief of Space Operations recommended the establishment of a National Spaceport Interagency Working Group in a white paper in August of 2020. The NISWIG, is that we like to call it, is chaired by the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and under the Department of Transportation in the United States. And we have representatives from a lot of other departments that have stakes in space: Department of Commerce, Department of State, of course, NASA, and both the Office of the Secretary of Defense and, of course, the United States Space Force. I won't read you the charter goals, but the short version is that we're trying to make sure that we pave a way for our federal spaceports and other spaceports to get after some of these challenges that we see coming, including specifically a lack of a specific investment mechanism that permits federal government, state and local governments, commercial space, and investors to jointly invest in spaceports. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in one of my other topics. Lack of certain standardized templates for applying environmental, safety, airspace, and frequency management standards and processes, and considering launch transportation systems, spaceports, and ground equipment needed to support the growing space economy. Next slide, please. So where we are, our current status is that the NISWIG met with our U.S. spaceport directors and launch service providers in both fall of last year and then again in June of 23 to solicit and get collaborative input on strategic goals and challenges. On 29 September, we are scheduled to present the final draft of the long-awaited National Space Force Strategy to the National Space Council Executive Secretary, which is Chirac Creek. General Panzenhagen, my boss, and I had the opportunity to brief him just a couple weeks ago, and he is anxiously awaiting the National Spaceport Strategy. And then through the rest of the calendar year, coordinating the draft Spaceport Strategy across all federal agencies with a goal to publish by the end of the year. So that's topic 1. I'll pause just briefly for questions before I go into the infrastructure investment update. Okay, so topic 2, as you're thinking of questions, the infrastructure investment update. A lot of exciting things are happening, and I'm sure many in this group, I don't have to tell that the spaceports are pretty outdated from an infrastructure perspective. While we occasionally get support for launch pads and like the shinier things that spaceports offer, it's the underlying infrastructure that supports it all that has really gone decades without any upgrades, talking about the things that are going to be incredibly necessary to increase capacity at our spaceports, power grid, water treatment, road upgrades, making sure that we've got future options for greater launch and landing locations, especially now that we're seeing landing ops at Cape Canaveral. And some of that comes with a focus on launch pad allocation making sure we have multi-user sites. Sometimes, you know, we share pads. That used to not be a thing, and now we need to kind of think outside the box on how we can help with some of this throughput that we're projecting, which I'll get to in a few slides. We were fortunate, my predecessor and Major General Purdy were fortunate they did a great job lobbying for why the underlying infrastructure for both the eastern and the western range out at Vandenberg were so important for a much needed upgrade. And we provided that to the Office of Management and Budget and to the Strategic Armed Services Committee, Strategic Appropriations Committee for their request last year. And we're fortunate to get a response to our request, which I'll get to on the next slide. But this positions the Assured Access to Space mission to leverage the coming commercial spacelift market boom, and will require us to continue to partner with state and local authorities. We're looking for mutually beneficial investment opportunities, and we're fortunate to get great help from other members potentially in this group, like Space Florida, California Go Biz, and we're going to need those to make sure that we can actually obligate and use this funding. Next slide. So here is our infrastructure investment plan. Pay no attention to the busyness in the charts below, other than to see how much this money will be useful to expanding what we call our Disneyland map on the right and our Disney World map on the left below, for getting after some of the critical infrastructure upgrades for both. You're looking at Cape Canaveral on the left and Vandenberg on the right. And we were fortunate to get more than we asked for, $1.3 billion in OMB passback for through the rest of the FYDP, FY24 through 28 for spaceport enabling infrastructure. And then we're working to make sure that we can actually execute. If you can look up at the graph in the upper right, we've got just a little bit of amount coming in FY24. That's because a lot of this is MILCON, and it takes a little bit of time to get MILCONs on contract and obligated. But we really swing up towards FY28, and we're going to have to be pretty persistent to make sure that we get all of that money and are able to use it, especially in the out years. Next slide. So just a quick blurb. A lot of members in this group, I'm sure, are very familiar with this, but why increased investment is necessary for our federal spaceports. We've got trends lines below that show like what our optimistic scenario forecasts look like for increasing launch rate. We're looking at projected 154 launches out of Cape Canaveral alone in FY24. So that launch rate places an incredible demand on the spaceport infrastructure. Right now, since we do not have our fiber in duct banks, we are required to like stand down during critical periods. And as we're doing, a significantly more number of launches, those stand downs during critical periods really interfere with other providers' ability to stay on schedule. So some of these infrastructure upgrades will allow us to, put this fiber in like protected duct banks so that we don't have to close roads and shut off certain sections during just ground processing, allowing less downtime for people that are trying to get ready for their own launches. We've projected that we won't have enough manpower, so we're trying to solve that. And we're projected that we won't have enough space vehicle processing about calendar year 25 on the Western Range, calendar year 26 on the Eastern Range. And we're working with industry and getting a lot of support to try to see where we can put payload processing facilities in order to stop those choke points from preventing us to get to those numbers and support our customers. So if you look at that graphic between the 1950s and the early days of space to 2015, how much of the amount of launches were government versus commercial, and then how much that has changed just in the last 8 years. Next slide. So I'll pause for a minute. That was topic 2, and topic 3 will be just how we're trying to solve getting after being able to ask industry if they would partner with us and consider paying for some of the indirect costs through legislative proposal 409. And I see a couple questions. Is the spaceport infrastructure considered a weapon system? So not at this point. to my knowledge, is the infrastructure considered a weapon system. It is critical infrastructure, but it's not a weapon system. And then second question, recently there was an RFP release for a digital transformation program to assist in launch and range architecture. Do you see the digital transformation an essential aspect of infrastructure evolution? Absolutely. The Spaceport is set up, or the Space Force is set up to be a digital service, and I think there's going to be a critical amount of automation and ML and AI as a part of like how we're going to need to get after this. If so much of the operations is commercial, why is the federal government paying for it? So that's an interesting question. It was not originally set up that way. It was set up as a test range, and we just haven't evolved. And I'll try to get into that a little bit in the charging policy changes. And I would tell you that infrastructure has been, or industry has been incredibly supportive in getting after a smart policy for how they, because a lot of our industry partners want to be able to invest in the ranges. And right now, there's not a good way to do that. So I'll get into a little bit more specifics when I talk legislative proposal 409. And when does the new charging policy fully take effect? Well, so I'll just jump right in here. So to answer that question, the new charging policy is still in conference in Congress. So there is House language and there is Senate language. They're pretty similar. The House added a few extra things, which you can see underlined on this slide. So the charging policy, I'd imagine, won't take into effect in the near term, just as we try to make sure that we're meeting that underlying fee specifically. The House has limited us to no more than 30% of direct charges and not to exceed $5 million a year per launch service provider. So there's obviously been questions about, you know, if you are a larger launch service provider and you're providing some of your own security, do you have to pay the bills for those companies who don't provide their own security? We're still trying to figure out a smart way to do that. And there's also questions about if you're a smaller company and you're looking to get into the business, should you be paying the same amount as an established provider that is actually making money off of their services? Those are just things that we're thinking through. So I love the interaction and all the questions. I think I'm gonna pause for a minute and go through LP 409, and then I'll come back to the budget allocations for Cape or Vandy. So just going through the direct and indirect charging, the bottom line of this, and I said it's been pretty well received in some of our roundtables with industry, is that it allows us to meet the capacity demand that industry is asking of us, and it allows the Spaceport services to keep pace with what we see coming as projected on the slide I showed from how much more we're going to do off of the Eastern Range and the Western Range in the coming years. So right now we've got a conflict between Title 10 and Title 50 authorities. Just the short version of that is we're working to try to merge those so that we can make more sense to the people, the industry partners that we're communicating to. We're going to charge indirect costs where we can as a rate. It could also be an in-kind trade. Industry sometimes can build roads faster than we can, going through how long the military construction process takes. So there could be an in-kind trade, and we're looking into those specific things. And we're working actively on future service catalogs with both ranges to clarify billing questions. So it makes sense that you'd want to know what you're paying for, and we should be able to say, an hour of radar costs you this. And so we're looking into how we can actually itemize a service catalog and make that more transparent in our continued desire to partner with industry. All right, next slide, please. I already hit what the ultimate goal is. We're just trying to keep pace and support commercial growth out of both the Eastern and Western Range. And that goes into the question, are all budget allocations only for the Cape and Vandy? Or are you looking for other launch locations? So right now, the focus on these efforts are for the 2 federal spaceports, the Cape and Vandy. But we are looking into what would be, from a contingency perspective, what might be other available locations. When will commercial launch providers be able to use existing federal law to operate commercial launches at existing launch facilities? I actually don't know the answer to that question. Like I said, we're working through some of the nuances, and right now it's hard for General Pansenhagen to even allow like greenfield development, what we call like the undeveloped land on the Cape. Those have different rules and fall under different titles than, say, if she wanted to reallocate a launch pad, which we have done. So we're trying to get Congress to make some changes so we can actually develop the Cape the same way that we would allocate a launch pad. I hope that answers that question. And then, are overseas spaceports considered an option to expand the current capacity? Yes, absolutely. We're definitely following the CSO's, the General Saltzman's line of partner to win, and there's certainly a desire to see like what partnerships with overseas spaceports could be considered an option. So when you ask, we get to indirect costs look like. I mentioned, you know, radar, use of the pad, but those are direct costs. Indirect costs are more what you see below, for examples. So if you're, as we bring more launch service providers onto Cape Canaveral, there's a need for additional contractor clearances, additional pass and ID personnel. There's just upticks of Patrick support services from Patrick Space Force Base that are going to impede progress if we aren't able to at least collect some of the costs and like fund additional people to help with the throughput that we know is coming. And next slide, please. So I already hit this, but the language is largely the same. It will go to conference in September, and we've got quite a few engagements in DC to just make sure that we can help. I would offer that without going into more specifics than I probably should right now, the not to exceed $5 million annually of total cost reimbursements is pretty low for what we think, and that's why I think it's been so well received by industry. And I think we need to keep it low at first until we can set up like actually what you're paying for and get that like service catalog itemization complete. And next slide, please. And I would say that a lot of our partners have been very willing to help, and especially if it increases the throughput, they've been very willing to be able to contribute back into getting after that goal of partnering to make these spaceports what we know they can be, and the vision of what we think is going to come out in the spaceport strategy. So our commitment that we've shared with industry is that we will use it to enable capacity, as I've already said. Industry will not pay for government requirements, and that we're committed to support the continued growth, that our industry service providers are critical to our national security, and that we will make sure that there's a fair and very transparent layout of what will be charged. And that Space Systems Command will host a regular forum to facilitate feedback from industry on how we're implementing these changes. And obviously we'll comply with congressional reporting requirements. Next slide, please. All right, so I've got a few charts in the backups that I can go into if you would like, but I will take questions if you have any more questions. I'm scrolling down. So does any of the language sunset, or is it permanently in the code? So that will depend on what comes out of the conference, but we're hoping to permanently get it into the code. The rationale behind the House language is, to my knowledge, just trying to rightfully protect how much industry is shaping this area of our mission. So we obviously don't want to hurt what we see as a vital national interest in like how well our partners have advanced this mission area. All right, does the federal government justify running and putting more money into spaceports? So this is why Congress is supportive of the change, because right now, and industry is supportive also, because right now when you say, you know, when it says, you say the taxpayers are paying most of the bill, especially as, you know, commercial launches have significantly outpaced national security space launches, it makes sense, and it's been well received. So yes, we are, from a philosophical perspective, we're trying to shift the government machine. Happy to take further questions or clarify anything that I said that you may have questions on.
Okay, Colonel DaSilva, this is George Neild again. Let me ask a few. First of all, I know the whole idea of assured access to space is extremely important to the Space Force. I guess as I listen to the direction that we're currently on right now, it makes me wonder, given that the vast majority of our focus is on Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg, if there were to be hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, launch pad accidents, it seems like some of those events could significantly impact our ability to use the existing facilities. Is there a way, at least in terms of our long-range planning and strategy, that we can start thinking about other locations from which to conduct our national security launches?
Absolutely, and that's something that I've spoken to General Panzenhagen, who's my boss, about in great detail, and she has those same concerns. Obviously, sitting right here, just had a hurricane pass by. There have been some natural disasters, wildfires out at Vandenberg, and there's definitely a desire, and I look forward to working with members of this community to partner to see how we can make these missions more resilient in the case of any of those natural disasters or other scenarios from a defend the mission perspective.
And I recognize that may take time, and if we look at the launch vehicles that we have available that we're counting on now, then it might be difficult to do something in the near term. But again, long range, I think there's a lot of capability out there. We have, as you know, 14 FAA licensed spaceports right now. Not all of them can be used for all of the launch vehicles that we currently have, but perhaps with other architectures or other developments in technology, that's something that we can be continuing to think about. One other question had to do with an area of great interest to me, and that is point-to-point transportation through space. I don't know if you've had a chance to focus much on the rocket cargo program and what the military might be able to do with vehicles that can take first cargo and eventually people from one side of the Earth to the other in just a couple of hours, but certainly interested in your perspective on that and what you think that might mean in terms of our operations in the future.
Sure, I would love to talk about that. That's actually been something that I've been pretty steeped in and I've been pretty excited about since I've got here in mid-July. I've actually had more exposure to rocket cargo and the humanitarian vanguard than a lot of other things. So sure, I'd be happy to talk to that. So when I was coming here, I thought I was going to focus on what I knew when I left 12 years ago, which is just a grown-up assured access to space mission. And I've been really pleasantly surprised that not only has this area boomed, which I knew in that mission area, but there's so many exciting future mission areas that we're grouping under the Space Access, Mobility, and Logistics, or SAML hat. Under that hat, we've got a lot of the tactically responsive space efforts that we're working on. We've also got potential on-orbit refuelers with a prototype possibly coming in 2025. And to your point, the logistics piece, that rapid logistics delivery or rocket cargo, being able to get things to the other side of the planet in a very short amount of time and drop off, humanitarian supplies as needed is something that we're actively looking at. I can't say a whole lot more than that right now, other than it's moving out pretty quickly. And my interest from my past, from my bio, is trying to work the policy pieces. While others work the technical pieces, I think I see my role as trying to work and facilitate some of the policy pieces and think through how would that capability be utilized. Hope that answers your question.
Very good, thank you. And let me change the topic just a little bit. All of us in aerospace these days are concerned about making sure that we have educated, motivated, and ready to go workforce in the future. Any initial thoughts on what we collectively can do to make sure that we have the right people ready to go for our workforce of the future?
Absolutely. So talent management is a huge focus for the Space Force. And I think, speaking candidly, that recruiting doesn't seem to be an issue, at least at the moment, not saying it won't be forever, but retention, keeping the right people interested, motivating this upcoming generation to not only want to get into this business, but then once they get into the business, exciting them with like all the opportunities and potential, and giving them enough mission command or enough free reign to get out there and make a difference, I think is going to be critical. So as we talk to the people that are going to replace us tomorrow, I think trying to break down, classification barriers, which the department is working very heavily on right now, so that we can talk to the American public about some very real threats that are facing the space business and our nation is critical. I think that getting out there and actually messaging to the American public, much to my chagrin, General Saltzman asked us to wear our uniforms on airplanes. So being an introvert, that's been a really good time wearing my uniform on airplanes, but it has given me the opportunity to talk to the public and express that I'm not dealing with aliens. I'm dealing with very, very closer threats. And so just a long way around answering your question about, I do agree that the more that we can expose the public to what we're trying to do, and the range and launch mission is a great one for that because it's very visible. And if we can get people interested in like what the future could hold, the conferences that are coming up, I'm trying to get max attendance at those conferences that were mentioned at the start of this, and sharing and having industry bring greater and greater ideas that like push the government forward. I think those things will be the best thing to enhance retention in this mission area.
Okay, it looks like we do have a few new questions, but let me offer you the opportunity to go through and your backup slides if you think those might be of interest to the group. Okay.
So I've been looking at can you expand on the scope and intent of the statement, industry will not pay for government requirements. In that case, the best example I can think of is, while industry might support or invest in what I mentioned earlier with like a payload processing facility, they would never be required to pay for like the government use of that processing facility. And so we're looking at different ways that we can contract in the future where we can commit to industry that you are paying for your use here, you are paying for distinct enablers for your capacity needs, while not paying for things that say the taxpayers should pay for. I hope that answers that question. Is one of the soft goals to develop capabilities to handle 2 simultaneous launch operations on each range? If so, yes, we have come very, very close here recently at the Cape to, in fact, we had on the schedule 2 launches within minutes of each other, and then as launch does, like that opportunity moved off. But especially with AFSS enabled launch operations, we are actively preparing to be able to not have to say no to 2 simultaneous launch operations. And I think that's something we've definitely got to get there as a commitment to our industry partners. So under the NISBIG or other forum, will Space Force call for consensus industry standards? We have talked a lot about standards, and standards are tough, right? Because it's like, as industry builds, we don't want to hurt what's already in work. And we've been talking a lot, especially in the on-orbit servicing realm, of how important it is now with how long space systems take to field, that we need to get common interfaces out. And we've got some very smart people working on that. And through some of Space Systems Command, like outreach efforts, trying to get out, if you do want to be able to be refueled, then what interfaces might you need to consider building in order to let that happen? So we're looking for that, and we're looking for input from industry on that. All right, is there a plan to bring FAA into the conversation? In part 420 and 450 regulatory compliance. So this, I will be the first to tell you, this is outside of what I have learned so far. So I'm not gonna wing it and take a guess. I will take that as an action and do my homework and try to be prepared to speak to that next time. All right. Is there maybe if there's a way I could get these questions? There's like incredibly thought-provoking questions in this thread that it would be valuable to be able to take these after the fact and just make sure that I'm tracking what the concerns of this very diverse audience are.
Yes, we're recording this, so we'd be happy to get those to you.
Perfect. All right, does part of this financial plan allow for commercial launch operators to utilize a commercial launch service provider instead of the Space Force? I believe so. This is also something that I haven't dug too deep into, but I don't know why this wouldn't be something that that we could figure out, and something that is of interest as my team works the manifest. So basically, the order that the firing order, if you will, off of both ranges. That some of that is, how are we looking at? Can a commercial rideshare go on a government mission? Can a government rideshare go on a commercial mission? And what are some of the things that we want to make sure that we don't hurt the primary provider or the rideshare? And just trying to think through what systems we can put in place to help facilitate that, as well as rapidly being able to swap. If the rocket is ready and we've got a backlog of payloads, how can we get away from the traditional way of doing business, which is the booster waits for its space vehicle, and trying to get out more of the message that if there is a national need, then, or an industry need, if you could get to that in the future, that if we have boosters waiting, especially for warfighter capability, that there might be more than we've seen in the past of rotating space vehicles and boosters. The other part of that I'll just throw out there is, with the manifest so congested, there's going to be a lot less of being able to just move, so we could really benefit from, as much as you can in this business, identifying when you think you're going to be able to go and trying to stick with that date, because it's going to be very hard. Obviously, there are heavy hitters, with human spaceflight and others, some of the national security space launches, but trying to stick as much as we can in this business to the dates that we pick will be critical to trying to make sure that we don't bump others unnecessarily out of the way. And maybe that goes back to options off of other spaceports in the future. Is making the spaceport as sustainable as possible in the future, renewable energy in the plans? Absolutely. We're concerned about sustainability both in the domain, as somebody mentioned, debris mitigation, as well as working with the environmental protection agencies, the national environmental protection agencies, especially as we proceed forward with these infrastructure upgrades, trying to figure out smarter ways of doing business and meeting some of these good mandates on how we're treating our planet and the environment in the future. There's definitely room and should be for that discussion. As far as, I'll be happy to address the propellant elephant in the room if you want to scroll to the last slide in the backups. So I'm not sure, this isn't so much a how green is this propellant, but it's more how it can keep scrolling, how can a more efficient propellant be brought onto the ranges? And this is challenging us in a really good way, the future liquid oxygen, liquid natural gas propellant discussion. So we're working actively to see how we can meet industry where they want to be with this propellant of the future. And we're seeing, quite multiple plans to use LOX methane, as we call it, like the Vulcan, the Starship, New Glenn, and Relativity. And we're working with these industry partners to say, how can we responsibly do this and make sure that we don't potentially put the public at risk, like while we're trying to do the ground testing and then testing out launching of these fuels for the future. So we're actively in discussions with industry and Congress to see if we can, again, like work towards what we are considering more efficient fuels. All right, scrolling down to look for more questions. All right, there is a talk of creating a new entity to run the Eastern and Western Ranges commercial spaceports. What happened to that and other options considered? So we're working actively with the FAA and NASA about, the goal is absolutely to get it to more of how can we run this the best while still protecting the public, how can we run it the most efficiently while still protecting the public. So I don't have the specifics about where that went, but I'd be happy to dig into that for our next discussion. But that's definitely on the table. There's not too much that's not on the table, especially if we can make these spaceports like more efficient. How do you plan on gaining a foothold on zero trust architecture? Oh, that's another doozy. Dr. Hodge, thank you for asking that. That's another one that I'm going to have to owe back to you. All right. Do you see a desire to make policy changes to government Space Force acquisition processes? So I would tell you yes, way above my pay grade. There is a desire for smart policy changes to make sure that, I mean, you've already seen that, right? I mean, like 12 years ago when I was a captain out here and a mission flight control officer, I mean, they told Elon that he'd never land boosters on the Cape. And I think that this is the best part of industry is, 12 years later, I'm watching from my driveway with my kids, is like 2 boosters land on the Cape. And I think that that's the best part is industry pushing us for smart policy changes while still, keeping the original intent and making sure the public stays safe. So I absolutely saw a desire then, see a desire now, especially on the acquisition process timeline. And just some of the red tape that we have, is it necessary or is there room for discussion?
If I can, let me ask another question. You mentioned earlier that certainly we're open to partnerships with our international allies, recognizing that that can be complex and difficult and take a while and so forth. Do you have any suggestions for how we can at least initiate some lower level informal discussions? For example, I'm headed out to Italy next week for an international conference on suborbital space flight. There's a lot of interest from Italy, the UK, and Germany, other countries, in terms of how can they help? How can they get involved? Can they have a spaceport in their country that might be able to assist with some of the U.S. projects using U.S. vehicles perhaps and others? And of course, that's what the Global Spaceport Alliance is all about, trying to bring all the parties together and talk with one another and learn lessons learned and so forth. Any suggestions on how expressions of interest or questions on how other countries, other space agencies, other commercial entities might be able to engage with the Space Force at the appropriate level?
Sure, absolutely. So we just sent a team from my office down to Peru to talk about what we'd be looking for in a partner to help them with some of their options and development. We sent one to Brazil last year. I would say probably the correct interface, though, isn't through Space Systems Command. I'd be happy to field these questions, but I think more appropriately, probably through SAF-IA, the Secretary of the Air Force, IA office, or through the Space Force S5P office. They specialize in partnerships, just to make sure that is it really the launch team and launch expertise you want, or is it looking for, or our partners want, or are they looking for different facets of the Space Force? So just from some of my Pentagon time, I think coming in through the front door and then allowing the service to help find the right team is probably the right way to do that, but I'm always happy to take those requests also.
Okay, and of course, one of the challenges is there's new players, big and small, and some of them don't have established Washington presences and familiarity with all of the typical constraints that we have. And so to the extent that there can be easier way to have initial conversations and people pointing them in the right direction, then that's always a good thing.
Yes, sir, completely agree. I think, the forums like this is why, this is incredibly worth my time today, and I'm honored to speak to you all, is that having you out there also helping us build these partnerships and reaching back to me. I'd be happy to help where I can. And thank you for including us in these discussions. We want to be an advocate for all this effort that you're working and help on that with the global spaceport development.
Okay, well, you've answered an incredible number of questions today and a really interesting presentation. I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us. Again, Global Spaceport Alliance is eager to support, to help out, to answer questions, to provide contacts, and have a partnership, if you will, so that it can be mutually beneficial. And we look forward to engaging with you in your office in the near term, and then having some representation at the Spaceport Summit. And of course, we'll be there in force at Space Mobility as well in Orlando in January.
Well, I look forward to continuing our collaboration, and I hope to see many of you then, if not sooner.
That sounds great. Any final comments that you'd like to leave with the group, Colonel DaSilva?
No, so this has been such a good learning experience for me. So thank you for all the questions. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So James Causey, we'll turn it back over to you to wrap things up.
Thank you. Well, Colonel, before you leave, that was the most interactive webinar we've had in the 8 years we've been running these things. So thank you very much for your patience with all of the questions. That was really terrific.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Everyone's got a busy schedule, so I just want to remind everyone, January 29, 24 in Orlando for the summit. And any suggestions you have with regard to content for the summit, please get it to George and myself as soon as possible. And then finally, just a gentle reminder, if you haven't renewed your membership, please do so quickly. Thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.